Ever since I was little, I knew the name of Al Capone, as I believe most people do. Recently, though, people have started to paint him as sort of a sympathetic, tragic hero, I suppose. While he did do some good, he really isn't the guy that a lot of people think he is. For example, he is responsible for the requirement for expiration dates on milk, which is relevant to his life in more of a way than you'd think. And that's a good thing, but he was also okay with the St. Valentine's Day massacre, so. But I digress. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, exactly 23 years before Betty White. Same day. And if that doesn't tell you something, I don't know what else will. Other notable people born on that day were Steve Harvey, Maury Povich, Muhammad Ali, Robert F. Kennedy, Jim Carrey, Michelle Obama, Kid Rock, Zooey Deschanel, Calvin Harris, and Ben Franklin. Yes, Ben Franklin did not stutter, Ben Franklin. Also, Rutherford B. Hayes died 6 years prior. Moving on. Al was born into a poor slum near the Navy Yard, though eventually his family moved to the outskirts of Park Slope, where Al would be exposed to a spectrum of culture, which is believed to have led Al into a life of crime, sort of. Al was actually a promising student until he hit a teacher back and was expelled. After rolling around in the literal cesspool that was Chicago slum crime at the time, he was picked up and dusted off by a gangster by the name of Johnny Torrio, who hired him to work in a bar. The same bar, in fact, where he said, and I quote, "Honey, you got a nice ass, and I mean that as a compliment, believe me." Quite forward, like a lot forward, like, hey, maybe tone it down a bit, buddy, forward. And that's probably what the woman's acquaintance's point was when he slashed Capone across the left side of his face, leaving 3 scars to show for it, which is where the name Scarface came from. Al would go on to hide those scars and lie about their origin, ranging from war scars to scars from a barber. Moving forward, Torrio would come to introduce Capone to bootlegging, and eventually Capone would rise to the forefront of bootlegging in Chicago, especially after Torrio decided to flee the country after an attempt on his life in 1925. After a hit that was called on 2 of Capone's enemies caused William McSwiggan, a public prosecutor, to get caught in the crossfire, Capone called a meeting to discuss some peace between the gangs in Chicago. The peace lasted for 2 months. 4 years later, in 1929, Bugs Moran was among many of the racketeers trying to encroach on Capone's business. Thus came the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where men of Capone and a colleague of his conducted a phony raid on a garage that Moran was to be lured into. This is when things started to go downhill for Capone. Not only did they fail to get Bugs Moran, but Capone was dubbed public enemy number 1, and President Hoover increased the push to indict Capone on account of tax evasion. In 1931, this caught up with him and he was arrested, and after a short 2-year stint in Atlanta prison, Capone was sent to Alcatraz after bribing a guard. Capone would eventually die of cardiac arrest after suffering from neurosyphilis. Now, today bootlegging isn't a problem because, well, neither is prohibition, but I'm not 100% confident that Capone would immediately get caught if he was doing some equally notorious crime today. People can still be bribed, and in one of the most corrupt states in the U.S., I wouldn't be surprised. Now, is that to say that it would be easier to catch him? Definitely. What I don't agree with is the punishment he received. But that's just on account of the lack of evidence, and there's not really anything anyone could have done about it at the time. That was short, because I'm not done. See, that's all fine and good, and I could turn that in, probably get okay. But I've recently come to know that some of my own family was very involved in Al Capone's game. I'm going to start by just going up my family tree. See, Al ran a cover business for years through Teamsters Union. This was about a milk truck company by the name of Meadowmore Dairy, which was in Oregon, Illinois. See, I told you the expiration dates related. My great-grandfather drove one of the milk trucks, which were owned by his father, who worked for the business that was owned by great-grandpa's uncle. The same uncle, in fact, who took part in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Sam Lewis. Now, Sam was sort of encouraged into the business by none other than Paul Ricca. Most of the family on that side worked under Paul Ricca, though some became many of the dirty cops that you hear about when you learn about Al Capone. Then comes the Severino side of my family. See, great-grandpa Angelo Severino ran a still up in Wisconsin, which he eventually got arrested for. Now, if anyone's done extensive research on Capone, then you may have heard about another Severino. Ernest, to be exact. Better known to the public as Ernie the Oven Severino. He owned a crematory, which was used to dispose of many of the bodies for the mafia. Simultaneously, he ran Bell's Gun Shop, one of the major suppliers of weapons to the mafia. Now, this is pretty good, but what about my father's side? Well, there's not actually much there. My grandfather, on his side, was part of the task force that took down Albert Taco, who took over the South Side racketeering in the 70s, but after that, nothing really of note. But that wraps up my relation. Funnily enough, I wasn't going to do any of that in my project, but when I mentioned that I was doing an Al Capone project, my mom jumped at the opportunity to sit me down and tell me all of these things. And reflecting on it now, I think it's very interesting that I had this very close connection to it. And I didn't even know. My great-grandfather died last year, and I had no idea that he had anything to do with that, and neither did my mother until a couple of years ago.